Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Right to Know, your weekly Pennsylvania policy podcast from the PLS Reporter. I'm Justin Schweitzer, joined as always by Sam Zern. Sam, how are you this week?
I am doing well. It was a pretty jam-packed week this week.
Yeah, there was really no shortage of developments and events to cover. We had a marijuana legalization rally. We had the approval of a statutory window for sex abuse survivors, committee approval, I should say. We had lots of press conferences on, the legislature's upcoming economic agenda, potential election reforms. So there was a lot, a lot to cover, a lot to handle. But it's starting to calm down. It is, Thursday when we're recording this right now. So session has ended for the week, which kind of gives us some space to breathe. But I think to start things off this week, Sam, we're a little less than a month out from when Pennsylvania voters will head to the polls and be able to decide on whether or not to give the governor's emergency powers an overhaul. And we've talked about this before, and this is something that you've been keeping an eye on. And I think just the crux of it here, before I hand it over to you, is that there are two amendments that are going to be on the ballot. One would limit the governor's ability to hand down a disaster declaration or declare a disaster to 21 days. And at that point, that can only be extended with the approval of the legislature. That's very different from things, right now, where the governor can continue extending it at will without legislative approval. The other amendment would give the legislature the power to terminate said disaster declaration without the governor's signature. And right now, Supreme Court ruling from last year determined that that termination resolution has to be given to the governor for his approval or disapproval. But this amendment, if voters choose to adopt it, would give the legislature the power to terminate it on their own. So that's kind of a quick run through. I hope I didn't steal any of your thunder, Sam. But again, this is something you're keeping an eye on, and you've been looking at it from multiple different angles, including, what the current COVID disaster declaration, what would happen if that would be terminated by lawmakers. So, if you could just kind of walk us through what you've been looking at, I think that would be helpful.
Well, I really appreciate you giving the definition of what the amendments are, because I think that's the starting point, just the basics, what they do. But obviously, these are inspired by the push for these amendments is coming after, as if it's over, the current and ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We're nationwide. We saw governors having to exercise a fair amount of gubernatorial power to kind of do their best job at staving off the worst of the pandemic early on. We saw in Pennsylvania lockdowns, the mask mandate,
business closures, yeah.
Closures, gathering limits, all that kind of thing come through the governor's extended powers under a disaster declaration. And those, while at the beginning of the pandemic, when we really didn't know what was going on, Governor Wolf and members of his administration have said they really think that the actions that we took early on helped stave off overrunning the hospitals in Pennsylvania. But pretty much after the first month of the pandemic in 2020, the partisan lines started to show up with regards to the emergency powers. So Republicans very early on in the pandemic did not like the use of power that the governor was using. Particularly, the rhetoric has been around business closures. Republicans have been very, very going very hard on the business closure orders, particularly with restaurants and kind of smaller businesses than necessarily the big box stores that stayed open because they provide a lot of groceries or a lot of items, that kind of thing. If you've listened to the podcast, if you pay attention to Pennsylvania politics, you've heard this argument for more than a year now. But now, as we're heading into this emergency powers constitutional amendment ballot question, um, it's heating back up again in kind of a new way. So this week we heard from GOP lawmakers who are urging people to vote in favor of the constitutional ballot amendments because they want to rein in the governor's power over the state in an emergency. They really want to see the legislature be the one to decide whether or not businesses close, or decide, any of the other like mandates or Department of Health mandates, that kind of thing that happened. They want that to be the purview of the legislature. And their argument is that it, returns power to the voters. I suppose that's in, kind of the legislature versus governor idea that legislators push a lot. They feel very much closer to the voters. That is a political ideology question that far smarter political scientists than me could argue. But that's kind of where they've been at this week, is urging a no vote. The governor, meanwhile, and other members of the Wealth Administration, so people in like emergency management or the Department of Human Services, are saying they're not necessarily saying that you should vote yes on, or that you should, they're not saying that you should vote no on the amendment. They're not making statements on the amendment itself so much as they are talking about the ramifications of losing a disaster declaration. And the reason that they're framing it this way is because back in 2020, Republicans in the legislature tried numerous times to end the disaster declaration, which, state officials, Wolf officials have said would have resulted in massive losses of aid for Pennsylvania. In particular, the one I've been looking at has to do with SNAP, which is a nutrition assistance food programs or food stamps program. In the last year, Pennsylvania has gotten more than $1.3 billion. It's going to be more than $2 billion here in a little bit, with some additional emergency funding, due solely to emergency federal funding for SNAP, which is only available to states that have a state emergency disaster declaration and a federal disaster declaration related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So very specific, qualifications around the ability to get that money. And the DHS secretary, Teresa Miller, or I don't know if she's secretary anymore.
She was secretary.
She was secretary. She has said that if we were to end the disaster declaration now, there's, that money would get cut off because SNAP is distributed on a monthly basis. It's not like one giant block grant we got. That money would be cut off. And a lot of, the client base who have, fluctuated in and out of needing SNAP throughout the pandemic would not be able to get extended benefits. Some of the flexibility would be lost, that kind of thing. So they're really pushing, the Wolf administration is really focusing on what ending a disaster declaration would mean. Now, I suppose it's not to say that if voters said, yes, the legislature has more power over disaster declarations, that would end the disaster declaration. I talked to a Republican spokesperson who said, well, we'd have to weigh all our options and that kind of thing. The vote is purely on the power over emergency disaster declarations. But based on a lot of the rhetoric we've heard from Republicans, it's pretty clear that were these powers extended, there would be moves to end the disaster declaration, the current COVID-19 disaster declaration, which is set to expire here in about a month, actually. So that's kind of like where we're at with the disaster declaration. I mean, there's a lot there. You're going to be seeing a lot of news come out for and against. We've been flooded in our inboxes with op-eds going every which way. So that's kind of like what's ramping up for the May 18th primary. And last thing to add, sorry, I was a little scattered there. Last thing to add, anyone can vote in this primary. So normally Pennsylvania primaries are limited to Democrats and Republican voters, party primaries. But this year, because there are these 4 ballot questions, every registered voter can vote on the ballot questions. You don't have to be registered for a party, or if you're registered for a third party, you can vote. So that's kind of something very important to know. And I believe I heard recently that like more than 600,000 registered voters have like signed up to vote by mail in this election. So I think it's going to be a pretty big one, especially for a quote unquote off year. There are no off years in elections. There's always elections happening. But without the fanfare of presidential election, it will be very interesting to see how these constitutional amendments push turnout in this off year.
For sure. And something I'm going to be monitoring that I'm just very curious about is whether there's going to be any like outside spending, to try and, influence the results of these ballot questions. I have seen, certain groups dump money into Facebook ads and things like that. So I'm really curious, what those totals are going to look like. But unless you have anything else to add on, the topic of disaster declarations.
I do not. I think more is to come.
Yeah, Sam and I were, before we started here, we were trying to figure out what to discuss this week because there's just been so much going on, from rallies to pressers to legislative action. But I think just in terms of an update, we've talked a lot about the statute of limitations window that has been a topic of conversation for months now, really, ever since an error at the Department of State kind of derailed an effort to amend the Constitution and create that 2-year window for sex abuse survivors to sue their abusers over crimes that are crimes that were perpetuated a long time ago, and that statute of limitations window had expired. So kind of rambled there, but anyway, so lawmakers had originally floated an effort to pass an emergency amendment, which would have fast-tracked the change to the Constitution. That ultimately didn't happen. Senate Republicans kind of abandoned that effort, saying a normal constitutional amendment was the proper option, both like legally and just politically. But in the last few weeks, we saw the House move a statutory window, a bill that would create a statutory window. So it wouldn't create it within the Constitution, but within a normal bill. And that's been something that Democrats have been arguing for a long time. Senate Democrats, Tom Wolf, Governor Tom Wolf, and even House Democrats and Republicans, because the House passed it. But that was kind of up in the air. And this week, the Senate Judiciary Committee, sorry, I'm getting distracted by snowflakes. It's April and there's snow in Harrisburg. But anyway, this week, the Senate Judiciary Committee actually advanced the statutory bill passed by the House. And, if you're not too in tune with what's going on in Harrisburg, you might be thinking, why is that such a big deal? And the reason for that is because Senate Republican leaders in the past had not been favorable of creating this window in statute. They had sort of rebuffed efforts to pass the statutory window. Both Jake Corman, the Senate President pro tempore, and Lisa Baker, the Senate Judiciary Chair, they had both been opposed to this option, and ultimately that led to the constitutional window being the one that was pursued. But this week they both, stood in the Senate chamber during a committee hearing, and so they were reversing their position. They said, kind of given all of the happenings around the original constitutional amendment that was passed in 2019 that ended up getting, kind of dropped because of the Wolf administration's error, that, lawmakers owe it to sexual abuse survivors to try and use all necessary options to create this window. And so, the legislature already passed the constitutional amendment this session. They need to pass it again next session. But essentially what Corman and Baker said was there's no harm in passing a statutory window. And, if anyone challenges the legality of that, then the courts can decide. So, that was a major shift in position this week that occurred in Harrisburg, and it's significant because it's something that 2 years ago didn't occur, despite pushes from advocates, other lawmakers, and everybody in between. And so, I think it's a result of the circumstances that the state kind of find itself in now, with that amendment that really got bungled and had to be restarted in the constitutional process. So I really don't know if I have too much on that. Other than that, it did pass out of committee with an 11-3 vote, I believe. But now there's no clear-cut indication of whether or not that's actually going to get a vote on the Senate floor. A spokesperson for Senator Kim Ward, she's the Senate Majority Leader who controls the calendar, what bills get run, what bills don't get run. She told me that Ward's office has nothing more to add on the topic. And Ward was pretty, vocal a month or so ago when she said the constitutional process is the one that the Senate is going to be taking. So, it leaves a big question mark there on whether or not, that bill is going to get moved. But, Corman and Baker and other Senate Republicans were resistant to the idea of, voting for a statutory window in the past, and we saw that change this week. So you never really know in Harrisburg, and this is just another prime example of that. But that's something to watch in the coming weeks to see if that'll get a vote or not.
So with that, I think
Yeah.
I want to transition to something else that's happening in the coming weeks. Justin, you have some news.
Yeah, this will be my last podcast as a member of the Right to Know team. I will be leaving PLS next week after over 2 years here covering Harrisburg. And it's, definitely a bittersweet moment and a sad moment. I look back and, when I came to PLS, I had worked full-time in marketing, doing freelance local government reporting on the side. I've obviously always been, a big journalism nerd and like a government nerd. And so I, went from covering like township council or township supervisors meetings and like borough council and stuff, to literally just getting thrown in the fire in like one of the largest like full-time legislatures in the country. And, it taught me a lot, and it really opened my eyes to how state policy impacts so much. And I think that's something that like people who aren't too in touch with like state politics, they probably don't realize it, just how big of an impact that state government has in their lives. And I think that's like probably one of the biggest takeaways I've had. But it's been informative, it's been fun. Like I've got I have so many wild stories that I can share on the podcast that I can't share on the podcast. State government is just, especially, this state legislature, it's a wild place and a ton of fun to cover. I'm super thankful I've gotten to do it for PLS over the last 2 years. So
I do want to put you on the spot here a little bit with some of those fun stories, but just to start, I know 2.5 years is, or 2 years, 2.5 years is a long time to think back, but do you have any favorite stories you've written or topics you've gotten to cover?
I've always been super interested in like government reform, right? Like no matter what kind of reform, whether it's like regulatory reform or ethics reform or, rules reform, that's always been super interesting. I think in terms of a favorite story, I really enjoyed digging into the status of like public records requests during the pandemic, because that was something that really was suspended in the first few months by most state agencies. They stopped responding to various public records requests at a time where people weren't getting a lot of information on a deadly pandemic. So kind of digging into how many state agencies weren't responding to requests. I put together like a little bit of a table so people could sort through who was responding and who wasn't, and just kind of using that and also adding like, just reporting on, what lawmakers thought, what transparency advocates thought, and kind of what reforms may need to result, or, may need to occur as a result of that. That was probably my favorite story I think I've done. It took a long time.
Yeah, those kind of like data and information driven stories are so fun, but it's hard to balance them with all of the, daily goings on.
Right, and that was like heart of like the onset of the pandemic. So like March, April, early May was when I was working on that, and so that was like balancing, updates on like statewide shutdowns and like bills to reopen the economy, and there was just so much going on, and it was like such an unprecedented landscape. So that was cool. Um, I don't know. Do you have
Any,
any other?
I
Yeah,
do, I do.
interrogate me all
So
you.
it's spring now, and like you said, there was a 420 rally this week, but we've also seen, the Department of General Service calendar is like filling up with rallies on the steps. The activists are back out with nice weather. I'm curious if you have any, like memorable rallies, or I know there's that feeling. We're work from home now, but our office looks out at the Capitol, and occasionally you will hear the beginnings or the music or the emergency vehicles rallying at the Capitol, and peek out the window. Do you have any like memorable organizer moments?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple. I think first and foremost, the one that's always going to stick out to me, and it was just so like, it was really just kind of a reflection of the times, and that was like the very first reopen rally, um,
Mm.
with, like people, trying to encourage the state to like open up. And I think it was mid-April, when everything was shut down, and people just flocked to the Capitol, and it was so interesting because, and I won't get into like, movements and stuff too deeply, but like there were people who were just straight up frustrated they couldn't work. There were lots of, Trump supporters and like right wing, like kind of militia-esque people.
Mhm.
It was almost like a de facto Trump rally at times, with like lots of Trump flags and like Gadsden flags and things like that. Like it was just a really interesting kind of political thing to observe. It was, um, some people argued that it was all grassroots. Other people argued that it was kind of astroturfed and like spurred on by like national like gun rights activists and stuff. Like there was just a lot going on there, and people were genuinely angry, regardless of kind of who organized it. And it was just, it's just one of those things that like it's probably like a once in a lifetime thing to witness. It was just, such a bizarre circumstance where like people were dying and people were getting sick, and then there was a whole group of people who like, there were like hair cuttings on the Capitol steps and like protests of salons not being open, and like, lots of lawmakers speaking, and it was just a wild event. People selling Trump merchandise, like there, it was just wild. Then that same year, um, I did cover a Black Lives Matter march that, one weekend, that marched from like State Street all the way down to City Island and like back to the Capitol. It was like a long rally. I was like running and like sprinting to like take pictures and cover that. And that was another thing. It was just, people kind of galvanized by a moment in time and like such a contentious issue, that being like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's deaths. So like, you know, there's just so much like raw energy in 2020 that it led to like, and it's not even getting into elections and stuff. But there was just, so much energy towards so many different issues on, all sides of the political spectrum. So those were two. Also enjoyed, it was kind of small. I enjoyed covering a, demonstration by March on Harrisburg where they ended up occupying Kerry Benninghoff's office and people got arrested, and like that was just contentious in and of itself because like it started with like chants outside and people were made their way inside and refused to leave, and the cops came, and I don't know. There's just always, I say this to people all the time when they ask me what covering Harrisburg's like, and it's just there's always something going on. Like, it's never dull. Maybe there's a slow week here and there, but it's honestly never dull.
The slow week is always just leading up to, the
It-
most energetic week.
right, right. It's the calm before the storm. Because if things are calm, they won't stay that way for long.
So I think with that, I mean, I could ask you things, but I'll just like text you other reminiscing
Yeah, please do.
memories. But you're gonna be on. I gotta let you go be on PCN later. Casual plug to our listeners. Check Justin out on PCN. Yeah. Anything else you want to add?
I don't think so. I just, again, I'm super grateful for, the opportunity to cover state government at PLS, and I'll be around. So, people will see me on Twitter. They'll see me around Harrisburg. So, I'll be around. But just nothing but good things to say about, PLS and my tenure here. We've had the podcast. We had a website update. We started a new newsletter. There's been so much. And my love all my colleagues at PLS, every single person, but like the people I've had the opportunity to work with directly, that's Andrew, Sam, Asha. They're the people I've worked with day in, day out. Marco Serino, Ataya, Irvin Mitchell, Mike Howells, all of those were like my PLS reporter family. And, there's 2 years is like, it seems like a short period of time, but it also seems like a long time. So just fantastic working with everybody, and could not be more grateful. So I guess that leaves us, at a good place to transition out for this episode. But, as always, great work being done at PLS and at the PLS Reporter. So in the meantime, I'll be around for a couple more days. So, if you want to check out our work, as always, head over to theplsreporter.com, where you can find all of our, written coverage. Podcasts can be found at righttoknow.podbean.com, or any of your favorite podcast platforms. So Spotify, Apple, iHeart. What am I missing, Sam? Google, that's another one. YouTube. So if you don't subscribe to the YouTube channel, head on over there and you can, watch Sam and I discuss, all the crazy stuff going on in Harrisburg. Twitter, that's the other one.
Yes.
Quite the disjointed last thing here, but yeah, you can find us all on Twitter. Our outlet is at the PLS Reporter. If you still want to follow me, you can find me at Justin_Schweitzer. And Sam,
I'm over at Sam_Zern.
Thanks for tuning in this week. It's been a pleasure being on the podcast. This is something that I started with Andrew Ball, my past colleague here, and Sam and Asha and Harrison Can. I got to throw his name in there. He helped me for a few weeks. It's been a pleasure being on here, and a pleasure talking to lawmakers and everyone else that has been a guest as well. So thanks for listening, and I will catch you around, and we will catch you next time.